So in this lecture, we're going to talk about infrastructure and career opportunities in addiction science. And we will trace the emergence of an interdisciplinary field. This concept of an interdisciplinary field focused on health issues is relatively new. But when you look at the history of addiction science, you will see that it was one of the first fields ever to bring together people from different disciplines in order to make sense out of a very highly complex phenomenon that not only strikes individuals, but has a major societal impact on population health. The current infrastructure for addiction science looks something like this. Numerous research funding sources that are interested in generating knowledge and building careers of people who dedicate their lives to the generation of scientific information about addiction. We need specialists in this field because it is so important from a public health perspective. There are now almost 100 specialized scholarly journals in the addiction field where people publish knowledge about addiction research. There are scores of professional societies. Some of them are subcategories or specialized sections in much larger professional organizations, like the American Psychiatric Association would have a section on addiction medicine, or the American Psychological Association has two divisions devoted to addiction and addiction research. There are many other professional societies that just specialize in providing services for people who do addiction research. In America, the Research Society on Alcoholism. Another one is the College on Problems of Drug Dependence. Each one of these societies has over 1,000 members who are pretty much dedicated to doing addiction research and sharing the findings of their research at annual meetings. There are 15 or 20 professional societies scattered throughout the European Union and increasing numbers of societies emerging in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. There are more than 200 specialized research centers that are dedicated to conducting addiction research throughout the world. And over 80 specialized training programs. The certificate program in addiction studies, of which this course is a part, is just one example of the specialized training programs that have begun to develop. And out of this, or within it, are thousands of addiction scientists. Some people who do a few studies on one topic and move on to another. Other people who just continuously work on programmatic research in a particular area of addiction neuroscience, genetics, psychological problems, public health, sociology, policy. All of these areas have addiction scientists who have an identity often with a particular disciplinary field like sociology, psychology, social work, or public health or epidemiology, but also more and more have an identity as addiction science professionals. So they see themselves almost as addictionologists as well. And that's a sign that a field has developed to the point where it has an identity of its own. This can be traced, for example, in the rise of addiction journals. The first journal that we know of was the Journal of Inebriety, which started in the United States in 1876 in the state of Connecticut. And it was devoted to reporting the results of research studies, theories, opinions on patients who were committed at that time to specialized hospitals or psychiatric asylums. And that journal operated for about 35 years, and then it went out of business in 1914 at the beginning of the First World War. In 1884, the British Journal of Inebriety began publication as a set of communications, mainly letters, among people who are interested in alcohol and drug problems. And the British Journal of Inebriety went through various iterations, and now it's called the Journal of Addiction. And Addiction is based in London, but it's the premier international journal in the field, and it's been publishing for almost 150 years. The Quarterly Journal of Studies on Alcohol was the first modern alcohol journal in the United States after the demise of the Journal of Inebriety. And that started in 1940. It was edited by one of the giants in the field, E.M. Jelinek, and it continues to this present day as the Journal of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs. Here's a chart showing the exponential growth in the number of addiction journals that have been published since 1884. And you can see starting around 1970, you get a dramatic increase in the number of journals, both non-English language journals, because many journals are published in French and Spanish and other languages, but particularly in the growth of English language journals. And the total growth has brought us almost to 100 specialized addiction journals in the field by 2015. This steady growth in addiction specialty journals, particularly since the 1950s or 60s, has been supplemented by what is now developing in scientific publishing, and which you'll learn about in this course, which is print journals are fading away. The journals that you would pull off a shelf in a library, what we now get is much more that is being published online. And print journals, in some cases, have stopped functioning, but have continued with the same name as purely online journals. Another trend in addiction publishing has been the dominance of English as the main language of science. This is true not only of addiction science, but almost all areas of science. It's a common language that people learn and can communicate with, although many articles are published in other major languages, including Mandarin Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and French. We have a variety of different ways of communicating in addiction science, and the number of opportunities to publish, as you saw from that chart, has grown dramatically. The purpose of an addiction journal is to provide a medium of communication for scientists, clinicians, policymakers, people who are interested in addiction from different angles. So they communicate by sending letters, by reading articles, providing commentaries, writing editorials, writing review papers. And all of that constitutes the life of a living journal. Journals deliver valuable information. They codify it, they verify it, they give it the support of a very strict editorial review process, and then they deliver that product to practitioners, other scientists, and the general public. A journal sets the agenda for a field of study. You can pick up a copy of a journal and immediately get a sense of what the important issues are. And if you go back to 10 years, they'll be different. If you go back 50 years, they'll be even more different. So the field evolves, going from topic to topic, but a lot of things remain the same. like an interest in developing better treatments or better policies. They also maintain ethical and quality standards. They require that people do their research ethically, that research participants have informed consent, that the research be reviewed by ethical review committees, and that the reporting requirements are scrutinized carefully by a scientist's peers, other scientists who will criticize the articles and help to improve them. Journals help to archive or create a permanent record of an area of knowledge. And this is done either in the print version of the journal or the digital version, or a combination of both. So 100 years from now, people can access the types of articles that were published and look at the state of the knowledge at a particular time in history. Finally, journals certify the authenticity and the originality of an author's work. So they provide quality control and make sure that knowledge isn't being plagiarized or repeated. They can publish articles that you know are reporting new knowledge. All of these things are part of the function of the scientific journal, which is the core medium of communication in the addiction field. And in the addiction field, about half of the, or more than half of the publications are published in disciplinary fields, disciplinary journals. Psychiatry, psychology, social work, sociology, public health. You'll see articles on addiction in all types of journal, including genetics and neuroscience. But many publications are also published in specialty journals, and that constitutes about half of the publications. Much of the research in the world is produced in the United States, but many other countries contribute as well, particularly the English-speaking countries, but more and more China, Russia, Latin America, the European countries are contributing to that fund of knowledge. Over the past 17 years or so, the number of addiction articles published has been growing, and it peaked around 2012, around 16,000 publications per year. It's gone down a little bit since then, but these are articles published on tobacco, illicit drugs, alcohol, and gambling. And this output has been prodigious. The decline in tobacco research has been somewhat dramatic over the past couple of years. We don't even know exactly why, but it could be because of the fact that with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, that there's less of a need for original research in tobacco. Addiction research centers are another part of the infrastructure. These specialized centers range from neuroscience and genetics up to policy science and prevention. And research centers provide dedicated facilities for addiction research and training. They constitute an optimal environment for training, and they're also a great place to work. Research centers often now are networked into collaborative networks that are supported by federal and state agencies. So the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse, for example, has a network of research centers devoted to sharing information and collaborating on treatment research. The growth of specialized research centers is similar to the growth of addiction journals. It's been progressive, it's been exponential, and it's a good sign that the infrastructure in addiction science has been maturing. And like the journals, more centers are located in the United States than in other countries, but more and more research is needed in different linguistic groups and in different cultural groups. So research centers are becoming more prominent in countries other than the United States. Research centers started increasing dramatically in the 1970s. Many of them at that time were devoted to research on alcohol. With the drug epidemic in the Western countries, drug research centers began to develop, and often centers specialize in both drugs and alcohol. There are some devoted to tobacco, and now more centers devoted to gambling. Another part of the infrastructure in addiction science is professional organizations. They've been operating for over 150 years. The oldest one goes back to the British Society for the Study of Addiction, established in 1884. And we now have many national research organizations devoted to addiction, as well as international organizations. The growth of professional organizations has been similar, with most of the growth occurring in the English-speaking countries and the United States during the 1970s and 1980s. But organizations continue to emerge even in recent years. So the growth has not stopped. These organizations typically run meetings, sponsor special events and conferences, and are a way of sharing information among people interested in addiction studies and addiction science. They facilitate networking, they sponsor scientific journals, and publish other scientific communications like research reports and policy briefs. They often provide information to policymakers and enhance the field by supporting training. So if you're thinking of a career in addiction studies, it's always good to become affiliated with one of the professional organizations. Another area that's been developing rapidly is education in addiction studies. Many institutions now offer certificates, undergraduate degrees, and graduate degrees in addiction science. We now have PhD programs in addiction studies. They're often interdisciplinary, and the ultimate goal is to advance research-based knowledge, practice, and policies, or to train people more specifically to be researchers. And here's a chart showing the growth of education programs in addiction studies. So, what does this all add up to? Careers in addiction science are the main identity for over 10,000 people around the world. People who publish regularly, conduct research, or manage research programs, or use science in clinical facilities or government agencies. Consists of basic scientists in pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, clinical investigators searching for new and better treatments, and applied researchers trying to solve difficult social problems. There are some troubling trends in the field that we'll talk about in this course. There are for-profit so-called scientific journals that really don't even exist on paper, much less digitally. But they have names that are confused with the names of legitimate journals. All they do is charge to publish a paper, and then it's not archived and it's really not reviewed. So predatory publishers is an emerging problem, not only for addiction, but for many other fields of science. The sponsorship of addiction research by organizations and for-profit companies, particularly or transnational corporations interested in addiction has led to problems. The tobacco industry sponsoring research has influenced the field of tobacco research very negatively by producing false information that delayed the application of policy science for many years, and it is now being continued by the gambling industry and the alcohol industry. These organizations try to set the agenda. They try to recruit sympathetic scientists, and in some cases, they can influence the research findings that are published. So, putting it all together, we have an infrastructure that supports careers in addiction science. And it's all for a basic purpose. And that purpose is basic and applied knowledge. That's what we produce as addiction science. And it starts with this infrastructure of training programs, research centers, academic departments, clinical facilities that provide a way for people to get interested in addiction science. It's often supported by patronage from funding bodies, philanthropic organizations, and government agencies, and it leads to the development of people with research skills, some of whom become career research scientists, but also people who continue to dabble in research or use research as practitioners and administrators. This process of doing addiction science is supported by professional societies and scientific journals, and it leads to the product that society wants, that society needs, which is basic and applied knowledge about addiction. In conclusion, there's been tremendous growth in all areas of addiction science, particularly in the last 50 years. There's been a disproportionate growth in the English-speaking and Nordic countries, but now that's spreading to other continents, particularly Africa, Latin America, South America, and Asia. The infrastructure is primarily supporting basic and clinical science, and to a lesser extent, policy science. But as the field matures, more and more policy research is being done as well. It is much needed, or going to be much needed, in the future in low and middle income countries, where the problems of addiction are likely to become very, very serious in the future. And unfortunately, we've devoted less attention to the population and public health impact of addiction, but research really is a way of improving our ability to deal with this massive global public health problem. So that's our introduction to the infrastructure and the history of addiction science.